Hey y'all, welcome back to my channel. This is Skylar Baker-Jordan, and today I am very happy to introduce you to a man that I have interviewed before for my newsletter on Substack. This is Richard Jacobs. Richard Jacobs came to me as the author of Democracy of Dollars, a wonderful book that came out. It was the end of last year it came out, correct?
It was the middle of last year. Yeah.
The middle of last year. And do you want to tell our viewers what Democracy of Dollars is about?
What Democracy of Dollars was about is the fact is that after traveling the 7 continents and writing some books and figuring out what's going on in the world, I kind of came to the realization to solve our problems, we had to solve democracy. Democracy is being directed by money and not by people. So I went through a history of democracy and the issues of money as they influence what goes on in our government. Because we become not a democracy of people, we become a democracy run by dollars.
Yeah, and it for those of you who want to know more about the book, you can read my review of it in the Substack that I wrote last year, and I'll pin a comment there in the bottom of the description. But the reason I wanted to speak with Mr. Jacobs here is because in Democracy of Dollars, you talk a lot about how the administrative state is used by industry to advance their agenda. And I'm sort of paraphrasing here, but is that a fair?
Yes. I have a chapter really which says that that's a major defect. Ever since our Supreme Court has decided that you can give unlimited money to projects, to political projects, that industry has then become the director of those projects, and they do that primarily through lobby. They do that through political contributions, and it's a tremendous amount of over delegation as a result of what's going on in the government today.
And that chapter immediately sprung to mind when I was reviewing the recent Supreme Court ruling in West Virginia versus EPA. And the thing about your book that I thought was really interesting and really relevant for our times is that you don't necessarily come at constitutional law through the traditional sort of left-right lens that we're used to dealing with, I think, in the media. You really look at it objectively, and you had criticisms for both parties and sort of both ideologies that are sort of, I think, competing for dominance within our judicial system right now. There's the originalists, and then there's, I don't know what you would call them, the Elena Kagans of the world. And you really, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you really sort of almost sided with the conservative justices, I think, when it came to the EPA ruling, and maybe not necessarily in that particular case, but in the sense that the administrative state really has gotten out of control and has usurped some of the authority that should be vested in the people's branch, which is the legislative branch. Is that correct?
Yes. To say it just a slightly different way, the Constitution, after 6 years of practicing law and studying the Constitution, which is sort of a hobby, I was a business lawyer, but the Constitution is my favorite part of what goes on in the world. The Constitution is quite clear. We have 3 branches of government, each with exclusive functions, and then there's some overlapping functions. But the legislative function belongs to the legislature, to Congress, to Senate, and to the House of Representatives. What has happened over the years is this. The first thing is that the founders of our country did not contemplate political parties. That was a flaw. They came to it when Jefferson started to run against Adams, but it wasn't part of the original Constitution. So many of the flaws in our Constitution relate to the fact they didn't think there would be political parties. So we start off with no political parties. Then we come to the stages, the decisions say money is not free speech. Money is a corrupter. And if you go back to the original cases, the long histories, anybody who lobbied or paid for votes corrupt. Then we had a major change that actually occurred during our lifetimes, primarily in the 1970s. It started to be that money was no longer corrupt. Money was just the way things are done. and the Supreme Court started to approve money as long as there was not what's called a quid pro quo, a direct connection to what was going on. In other words, I can't pay you to vote for me, but I can pay you to support your policies, which gets you to vote for me. You know, it's a funny link. And then we came out with the Citizens United cases, which is not really just one case. There was a whole series of cases. And although some people look at that as a free speech case, that you have the right to give free speech, they were trying to make a video that wasn't very nice to Hillary Clinton. But that isn't what it was about, because what happened is when the Supreme Court got the case, they sent it back down to be rebriefed. And the rebriefing was not the fact that they were talking about free speech, but they were talking about what's the place money plays in all of this. And it was rebriefed that money then facilitates free speech, and there's no constitutional way we can stop how much money you spend. And therefore, money became the great influence of what goes on. That shifted the way Congress works. By that I mean, if you go to Congress today and read about what goes on in Congress today, the congressmen spend over half their time raising money because they got to now raise it to stay in office. They spend millions of dollars. Most of that money comes from the elite, by the top 1%, top 5%. It doesn't come from folks all around. It is some money. You know, you might give $100, but you're not going to give $100,000. Or in the case of, say, Florida's governor today, DeSantis, he's already collected over $100 million, and he hasn't even announced that he's running for president. But he's got $100 million in the kitty. He's out in Utah now, raising money. That's where we are. So Congress devotes its time to raising money to stay in office. They then passed legislation which is flawed. Legislation is broad-based and it's stated, we want to do this. And they pass the legislation and delegate to the executive branch. The executive branch then has administrative agencies. They set up these administrative agencies to run our government, including the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency. And because of the flaws in the laws given to them, the president and his executive agencies pass rules and regulations. Now, many of those rules and regulations are not statutorily authorized. And what went on in the EPA just recently is an example of that. So they pass rules to try to make the government operate because Congress doesn't work. It doesn't work. But that has another side effect, which I think is horrible. And I do talk about this in Democracy at Ours. The horribleness is every time there's a change in administration, the rules change. So, for example, the Obama administration decided we ought to have clean energy. That's a worthy objective. Everybody knows that we ought to have clean energy and we can't keep using all the natural resources from fossil fuels like we're doing right now. So they passed a clean energy rule. They then decided that the rule was too broad beyond their authority, and they fundamentally withdrew it to rewrite it. All right, then Obama's out of office. Trump comes into office. He rejects the whole thing and throws it out. So, you know, you can't sit here and say, you and I can't talk and say, hey, if the president could pass this EPA rule, have his agency pass this EPA rule, we'd have climate change because the next president threw it out. All right, then Biden comes into office after Trump, and he doesn't pass a rule. He just says, I'm going to go back into this and figure out what rule we're going to have. That's where we were when this case came to court. No rule, a proposal to put a rule in that had been revoked by Trump, originally proposed by Obama. No stability at all in the law, a total mess. Okay, and where the court stepped in, that I think is totally wrong, is they came in and said, hey, EPA, you can't pass rules that do this, that shift the energy cycle from where it is today to clean energy and put coal out of work. That's what they said. But there was no rule in front of them that they had to say that. They didn't have to say that. The typical thing is what they would do in the past before we had what I would call our conservative Supreme Court. They would say the matter was not ripe. There's no rule here for us to decide. You'll go ahead and pass your rule, then bring it to us and we'll take a look at it. That's the way they would normally do things. They would say it was not ripe, but they didn't do that. So my feeling is we have this kind of as a summary of what happened. We have a summary of a change in administrations from Republican to Democrat, a proposal to make a rule that never was made, and the Supreme Court legislating, which is beyond its constitutional powers, to come in and say, okay, you can pass rules, but you can't pass the one you're thinking about passing. They didn't used to do that, and that is constitutionally wrong, and frankly, it's morally wrong. So I'm opposed to this overdelegation to the executive branch because there is no stability at all in it. You know, you can go to gun rules, you can go to way beyond EPA, you don't have stability. But you have now a Supreme Court that's decided to legislate, which is beyond the scope of what it says within the Constitution it should do. And it really should shut up about this.
So the Supreme Court, in making this decision about a rule that isn't even in place, may have overstepped its mark, but do you agree with Elena Kagan that Congress, I mean, I'm sort of paraphrasing her dissent here, and I believe it was Elena Kagan who made this dissent. I've lost sort of track of which justices have authored which.
Yeah.
But she essentially said Congress was too stupid to make environmental laws. Is that true, or is that just a problem of who we're electing, if that's the truth?
This is a case where both sides have something intelligent to say and both sides have something unintelligent to say. Okay, if you go back and go back to the chapter I wrote in Democracy Dollars, which obviously didn't consider this case because it wasn't out. Kagan said, if we don't allow this kind of delegation, we're going to put half our government out of business, you know, because we've done it for so long and so much it happens. Now, okay, we need expertise of administrative agencies. When the Supreme Court originally approved delegation, I'm going back, you know, several decades, it approved it because it said this gave expertise to the decisions. Now, that was a good idea. But unfortunately, what happens is, who runs the administrative agencies today? It isn't the experts. It's political appointees which have no backgrounds. You could take DeVos and education, you know. She comes from a very wealthy family of Catholics who don't believe in public schools and did their best to dethrone public schools. And that isn't what the Department of Education is supposed to do. What should be done, which will be very difficult to do, is that Congress should set up the expertise to guide it when it passes the laws and pass laws with more meat in them. So when they delegate to the administration to work under those laws, the administration has better guidelines and fills in the details. To be honest with you, I'm not sure it's going to happen in your lifetime or my lifetime, but that's what should happen.
Yeah, and I think that that's one of the things that the left has lost sight of in a lot of ways, is that the administrative state as it exists today is not necessarily advancing the interests of the everyday people. It's advancing the interests of industry. And
Totally.
we have relied, I think, especially on the left, but I think on the right too, I think it's a general American problem. We've relied on the administrative state and the courts to do the job of the Congress, and in some cases the executive branch, but certainly the job of the Congress. Going to another recent Supreme Court ruling, a lot of people are saying that that was the sort of original fatal flaw in Roe v. Wade, is that it was not allowed to go through the democratic process, but instead was litigated in the courts. And if the Supreme Court gives a right, apparently the Supreme Court can also take away that right. Do you think there's a similar dependence upon these other branches of government to do what we should be doing as citizens through the legislative branch for things like abortion?
Well, he raised a couple questions really in your question. The first question is that let's talk a little bit about this legislation by the Supreme Court first, then I'll get to your question. This is not the first time the Supreme Court has legislated. And they also legislated in the abortion case, which I'll come back to. But if you go back to the Gilded Age, back in the late 1800s, one of the worst things the Supreme Court did without being actually having a case to decide, they decided corporations had the right of people. I discussed that again in Democracy of Dollars. That was because of the railroad industry, the growing industry in the country wanted to have not only a president, but a court that supported industry. And they got an appointment. I mean, if you go back and read the politics, we actually discussed. And so the Supreme Court told the lawyers arguing the case, you don't have to argue this. We've already decided that corporations have rights of people. They're not supposed to do that. Okay, now let's switch. So this is not the first time. I could go through dozens of examples of this. Well, let me give you one other one. When Justice Roberts decided that the states no longer had to come in, southern states no longer had to come in with their segregation policies in schools, you know, Congress had a law on the books that said states that had been discriminatory in education had to go and before the courts and present their desegregation plans. Florida happened to be one of those states rather, and they had to do it to get approval. And Justice Roberts in the Supreme Court just said, "Hey, yeah, the law's there, but it's out of date. You don't need to do that anymore." That is legislating. And if you go back to Justice Roberts as a young man before he ever got to the Supreme Court, he was on a case representing a client who took that position. Okay, and that isn't so good. All right, now let's go to the Roe v. Wade case, the abortion case. That case did not have to be decided that Roe v. Wade had to be overturned. And historically, the court would not do it. What was before that court was the fact that a state had said they wanted to have a 15 weeks, right? Wasn't it 15 weeks versus the 26 weeks? That's all they had to decide. Now, Roberts got that right in his concurring opinion. Historically, that's what the court would do because the court has historically said, we will not attack or discuss constitutional issues any more than we have to get the case decided. So they could have just decided 15 weeks is okay or 15 weeks is not okay and left the whole thing alone. That's what they should have done. They didn't do it. All right, now why didn't they do it? Why did the court attack the whole thing? If you look historically, what's happened in what I would call the stacking of the Supreme Court, we have 9 justices. 7 of them are Catholic. Do we honestly believe that 7 judges whose fundamental underlying beliefs are Catholic, which is opposed to abortions, could bring their professional opinions to decide that we ought to have abortions? That's a big leap of faith. You know, we decide things first based on what we believe, and we usually find facts to fill in to support what we believe. Justices are no different than the rest of us. I could discuss this with a gun case if we have time. The same idea. All right, so we have a court which is essentially become almost a religious court. Get right down to it. If you look at all the cases, the prayer. Remember the prayer case where the coach could bring people to the middle of the field and pray. Another example, if you over 80% of the cases that have come before the Supreme Court that have religious overturn have been decided in favor of the religion. That, you know, it isn't that I don't believe in religion, believe in God. That's not the issue. The issue is that's not what the court should be doing. All right, now let's go back. The Roe case was decided originally by Berger. When I was in law school, it was just after I got out of law school. I'm an old man, 91 years old. So I was in law school when the Warren Court was there. The Warren Court was probably one of the most progressive Supreme Courts we've ever had. It was headed by Justice Warren, who happened to be a Republican appointed by Eisenhower, but today he'd be considered a far left liberal. And they got all the rights of criminals. It was an exciting time to be in law school, I got to tell you that. All right, but what happened in the liberal courts made a very serious mistake in those days. They decided that some of the rights that we have, you and I have, like the right to privacy, which is going to be under attack here fairly soon. They decided that was not found in the Constitution or in the Bill of Rights, but in what Justice Douglas, who wrote the opinion, found in the penumbra of rights. It was in this mist that surrounded the Bill of Rights. Now, that was very artistic to read as a young law school student, and it certainly excited me. But, as I look back now, that was wrong. I have a chapter in Democracy Dollars on the Ninth Amendment. The Ninth Amendment is probably one of the most important amendments to the Bill of Rights, the Ninth Amendment, because what it says is we have unalienable rights that are not stated in the Constitution, and nothing in the Constitution takes those away from us. That was a big debate when these rights were being adopted. They knew they couldn't make a list of rights that you and I had because they'd leave something out. So the decision was, we're not going to make a list of rights that people have. Alito says he couldn't find abortion in the Constitution. Well, that's a pretty stupid thing for a judge of his stature to say. Never was intended to be in the Constitution. The Constitution is nothing but a statement of principles. It's not a rule book. Okay, so anyway, the Ninth Amendment says, hey, look, we as people, if you go back to the Declaration, it says the same thing. Governments are formed because we have unalienable rights, and the governments are supposed to protect those. The Ninth Amendment says those unalienable rights that we have are not all stated in the Constitution. They're not all stated in the Bill of Rights, but we got them, and you better take care of them. All right, now, had this Roe v. Wade been decided under the Ninth Amendment, they would have gone back into support for what they did, and Alito couldn't have made the stupid statements that he made. I can't find it in the Constitution. It wasn't supposed to be there. Now, why didn't they do it? Again, if I'm going back talking a little bit about Democracy Dollars, but there were many people that were conservative that were afraid to say, they were afraid that they were legislating if they said what rights were that weren't black and white. Okay? I mean, there's some merit to that. But of course, now they don't have any problem saying it if it disagrees with their belief system, right? So, they're not really doing what they're saying. But if you also go back in, I did a blog on it not too long ago about it. If you go back into what people thought about abortions back in the days of the Founding Fathers, they didn't think birth occurred until birth occurred. You had to have a birth before you had a life. So it wasn't an issue.
Yeah, Benjamin Franklin included in a book he published in, I believe, 1741, what essentially amounts to a recipe for an abortion. I mean, this was not an. I mean, it struck me when the court, said there was no, deeply held right in the tradition of the United States, or however they phrased it. I can't remember the exact phrasing, but it was essentially, this right does not have deep roots in the history of this nation. I can't think of anything having deeper roots in the history of this nation than a recipe in a book by Ben Franklin.
Yeah, well, you see what they're trying to do. What they're saying is, if they didn't think of it in 1776 and 1789, it doesn't exist. That's what they're saying. There was
that's a terrifying thought, is it not? I mean, that's really...
It's a horrible thought, and it's contrary to what the founders thought, because they said, and again, I quoted some comments, which I think came out of Madison's. He's James Madison's the guy who kept the record of what went on when they passed the Constitution. And they said, hey, when we pass the Constitution, we have to think of future generations and how it's affects future generations. They were thinking of principles. But, there was a case, again, that's also cited in Democracy Dollars, where courts held that we don't have a right to a clean climate because it wasn't one of it wasn't a rule back, you know, it wasn't, nobody thought about clean climate back in those days. But he's missing the point. The point says we have liberty, right? We have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. If the clean climate doesn't allow us the right to life, which it doesn't, it kills people. It doesn't allow the happiness because it's making everybody miserable. And, you know, if you go right down to it, he was looking at the wrong principle. You know, so we have this. What people are doing is manipulating the Constitution to deal with a fundamental thought that has nothing to do with the Constitution. Just because it's something they think they want to do it, you know, so it's really troubling.
It is, and it seems like because Congress is so gridlocked and perpetually gridlocked. I mean, my entire life, we've seen very little substantial legislation passed. I mean, the Patriot Act is probably the first one that comes to mind as far as I was old enough to understand what was being passed, but that was when Republicans had majorities in both houses and they held the White House. And after 9/11, there was this, you know, it was a very unique period in modern American history, a unique period that lasted maybe 6 months, but of national unity. But, you know, other than that, I mean, there was, I suppose, the bailouts and the Great Recession would count as massive legislation. Congressional gridlock. Sorry, I'm at a coffee house right now. Congressional gridlock really has hobbled us to the point where the legislative branch cannot respond to the overreach of the courts, has it not?
That's correct. But see, I'm not sure it even wants to, because it would interfere with their ability to raise money. I mean, I think it would. It would just simply interfere with Congress. No longer wants to legislate. They want to bitch and they want to raise money. You know, and there's an ad. I know you're not in Florida, but there was an ad just run about Senator Rubio, the Florida senator. The ABA, under the Citizens United, is running a series of ads of what a great man Senator Rubio is. They run it every baseball game. I get a chance to see that every time there's a baseball game. And
did you say the ABA? Is that the American Bar Association?
Banking.
Banking.
Yeah. American Bank. So American Banking, Florida bankers are running this ad about what a great guy Rubio is and how he's doing all these wonderful things. Now, of course, you know, that isn't a pretty pro. They're not asking him to advance any particular legislation. So under the definition of corruption, which our Supreme Court has adopted, which is very narrow, this is not corruption. But does anybody in his right mind think that if a major institution like the American Bankers Association, the Florida Bankers Association, run ads and tell the whole world how great I am and how much I'm doing for people, that if they ask me for a favor and it gets me elected, I'm not going to do it? I mean, that's the silliness. We have an ivory tower approach to a problem solving rather than a human living approach to problem solving. You've got to live. You've got to have experience. Pardon me for getting on a soapbox on this. I've been very lucky, besides having practiced law for an extremely long time. I've trekked the 7 continents and been around the world, and wrote a book called Wanderlust many years ago about the lessons I learned in those travels. One of the lessons I learned is dirty hands, wet feet learning. You got to get out there and you got to learn. And you've got to do it. You don't learn it in the virtual world. You learn it in the actual world.
Yes.
We have a Supreme Court. If you look at the background of those judges, all of them come from the same 2 law schools except one. They all didn't go out and practice law like I did in the hinterlands, so to speak. You know, they all got clerking jobs with other judges, They never got out and got their hands dirty or their feet wet to learn what's going on in the world. And that lack of experience, coupled with these, the fact that beliefs top facts when fundamental beliefs conflict with facts, creates a problem for us. Their decisions, I think, are very ivory tower. Let's go back to the Roe decision. As I told you, I think the court decided that under the wrong decision. That doesn't mean the decision was wrong. I mean, they didn't decide on the wrong decision. They decided on the wrong part of the Constitution. Excuse me. It doesn't mean that the conclusion was wrong. The process was wrong. They could have corrected the process. They didn't. They went to the ivory tower and said, "Hey, this is wrong. The hell with the results. We're going to get rid of it."
Yeah, and I think that's been the rise over the last, and I don't know, perhaps this has been going on longer than 50 years, maybe 75 years, maybe 100 years. But does seem to be the rise of the career politician. You don't have people, people like Cori Bush, who is a Democratic congresswoman in her first term. She represents St. Louis. And she was a registered nurse before she was in Congress. Those people coming from the working classes or people who have had real world experience like yourself seem to be fewer and far between. I mean, I suppose on the flip side, Rand Paul was a practicing obstetrician or optometrist, I'm sorry, before he was a senator. But largely, I mean, they kind of take a very typical path that involves, like you said, these ivory tower prestigious positions that funnel them into the halls of power. And it's like J.D. Vance going to Yale Law, and then, from then on was really groomed, I think, to become if not senator, a congressman or a governor, or certainly to enter the halls of power within the Republican establishment. And I don't think it's just a Republican problem. I think the Democrats very much have the same problem. But how do we combat that when suddenly being a politician has become not an issue of public service, but a career prospect?
It's a very difficult problem. If you go back, a few, I don't know exactly how far, but let's take the Supreme Court, because I think I'm more familiar with that. The Supreme Court did have a better mix at one time of justices that came from across the country and from a variety of experiences. And many of the cases that came before the court were then based on experience. Were based on experience, and they're not today. Today, there was also a time when the justices that were proposed were vetted by the American Bar Association. That stopped with Bush, when Bush was president. Trump, of course, didn't follow it. The justices now are not picked because they were vetted for their background, their experience, or their intelligence by the American Bar Association. They're now vetted because of their political connections, and that's a significant problem in the selection of judges. It just is a significant problem. When it comes to career politicians, should we have term limits? Can you hold for a second? Put me on. My wife is calling me. Hello, I'm on the call. Okay. My wife is here, said she doesn't know about this call. At any rate, she knows about it, but she doesn't know I'm still on. At any rate, there's been talk about term limits. That would take a constitutional amendment, more to do that for Congress.
Yeah.
The judges, you have a little bit of a chance. Judges are appointed for life, but the fact that they're a federal judge does not necessarily mean they have to be on the Supreme Court. So there was a bill that was passed by the House and never got any further than the House. That I think it was after 17 years they have to swing off of the Supreme Court and go on to other courts. We need to have a turnover. Again, if you go back, how long was life expectancy when the Constitution was adopted? It sure wasn't 80 or 90.
Yeah, that's true.
In fact, when I was in law school, when I was in college at the University of Wisconsin, I remember writing a paper. Life expectancy was 65. Nobody was supposed to live to where I am now, 91. You know, so that you have all these, you have facts changing. You have facts changing what the Constitution says, and we have to be able to deal with the facts. We can't live in the dark ages.
No, and it does seem like if the Constitution is frozen in time, that it then becomes not only a useless document in a lot of regards because it can't respond to the needs of the people in 2022 if it is stuck in 1789 or the 14th Amendment in 1868 or, whenever. But also then, how can you argue that this document commands the consent of the governed? And if it doesn't command the consent of the governed, doesn't it then become illegitimate?
Well, that's a good point. It does. But of course, I think it was Thomas Jefferson said that we ought to have a new constitution, every 10 or 20 years?
Yeah.
He was right, but our Constitution is also written in such a way it's almost impossible to amend. It
really is a very difficult document to make any changes to.
There was in the 1920s, there was a proposed amendment called the Equal Rights Amendment, where women were to have the same rights as men. It never came before Florida to approve it. It's never been approved. Now, why hasn't it been approved? Because there are a lot of people in our legislators who think it's a male's world. The women shouldn't have the rights of men. They make such silly things. Well, if we give women the same rights as men, they won't be able to get alimony. I don't think that isn't how you make decisions. The point of it is, it should have passed a long time ago. It never did. And if you get right down to it, we're living in a world which coalesces power into a small group of people.
Yeah, Jill Filipovich, who is a columnist and a writer who I've read for many years. I don't know her, but she had an article, I think it was in her Substack newsletter that I just read today, that essentially said, Brett Kavanaugh wants to have a right to privacy, and the right wants Brett Kavanaugh to have a right to privacy because that when they ruled that the right to privacy didn't exist for women and abortion, and they overturned Roe v. Wade, they meant specifically for women. Men have always had a right to privacy in this country, and that's why they're upset. And I don't want to sit here and accuse 6 Supreme Court justices who I have never met of being, wanting to turn us into whatever Margaret Atwood's dystopia is called. I can't think of it at the moment, but certainly it does seem that there is a level of hypocrisy at play here with our betters demanding, rights that they have stripped from the rest of us.
Here's the problem: as it goes back, fundamentalism and religion, if you get right down to it, it goes back to the fact is, as I said, and I think the Supreme Court is a group of very smart people. Okay, they have to be to get there. But their fundamental view of life is very fundamental, and that is a serious problem. There's this. I don't know if you read the book Jesus and John Wayne.
No.
You need to read it because it was written by a professor at a Christian college. What's going on today is nuts. And she has researched the book. It was one of the most heavily researched books I've ever read. It's a fantastic book. But if you go back to it, what was the American family like in the minds of many people when I was in law school? Go back to the 50s when I was in college. It was a man-dominated school, right? I worked. Was married in college at the University of Wisconsin. So I was married and had 2 kids when I went to law school. I would have been shocked if my wife had worked. That would have been against everything that I dreamed what was the way things should be done, because it was a man's responsibility to take care of his family. The man was the head of the family. The woman stayed home and took care of the kids. That's the way the world worked in the 1950s, in the 1960s. Now, having now practiced law for 60 plus years, the world has changed, right? When I was in law school, very few women were in law school. The first time I ever had a case against a woman, she cried, She cried. They don't do it anymore, but she did then. The world has changed, and we have to keep up with the world the way it is. I no longer have the right to dominate. I'm now a partner with my wife. I've been married 69 years, so somehow she's tolerated me, But the point is, the world has changed. The role of women has changed. World War II started that.
Yes.
When women didn't work before them, but when all the men went off to war, women had to work, and they did. And they did a better job, in many cases, than men.
And they gained a sense of what liberty is when you are free from the constraints of, I think, the nuclear family and sort of the cult of domesticity that had forced women into the house really since the 19th century and before.
Yeah. So we have, the Constitution has to keep up with the facts. Facts, the changing environment that you and I are living in.
Well, what happens, do you think, when we have a Supreme Court now that looks not only determined to stop the march of time, but indeed to roll the clock backwards? What happens to the court when it is so far out of step with the American people?
Eventually, it will lose its authority totally. If you go back to the Depression, when Roosevelt became president. If you go back to the early cases, we had a very, very, very conservative Supreme Court in those days. And the first laws that Congress passed, that Roosevelt had introduced, were thrown out as being unconstitutional. There was such an uprising. In fact, there were some people, some communities that had straw judges hanging from lampposts, It was, people objected to the point, and then suddenly, realizing the court had lost its authority, the court changed its mind and never then found another law of the New Deal to be unconstitutional. I forgot which one of the presidents said it. But when John Marshall, who was the first really well-known Supreme Court justice, passed a law about something, and the president at the time said, "Well, Marshall passed the law, let him enforce it."
Andrew Jackson.
Andrew Jackson. Okay, yeah. What we have today, unfortunately, is instead of people standing up to this, particularly the left on the left, particularly the liberals, they get disgusted and don't vote. I know in the election when Hillary Clinton was running for president, and I had many friends who were Democrats that couldn't support her, because of all this corruption stuff that came up, and they voted for a third-party candidate. I kept telling them, that's throwing your vote away. If you got two candidates you don't like, you got to vote for the one you dislike the least, because otherwise you're going to get the one that you dislike the worst, and that's what happens. That is just what happens, and we can't do that. We have to become very active. Now, the Democrats are not flawless in this. Okay, what happens at all? In fact, one of the things that I did probably 6 or 7 years ago, I was on a committee for the Pinellas County Education Foundation, because they great supporters of public schools. And there's a problem because boys, if you look nationally, boys fail more than girls. Boys drop out of school more than girls. And so I wrote a research paper, a white paper called "Why Are We Losing Our Boys?" I turned out to do some good. Pinellas County adopted it. They changed the way in which they educate boys. Okay, most of the teachers obviously are women, and therefore they would tend to educate boys like they think girls ought to be educated. But boys they're different. They're biologically different than girls and need to be educated differently. So the Democrats have the same responsibility to look at the facts and make sure that their beliefs are supporting the facts and their beliefs are not polluting the facts. That's Democrats and Republicans alike have got to do that.
Yeah, we've become a nation where we put ideology above, I think, facts and above outcome in a lot of ways. And we need to, I think, both sides approach issues with a far more open mind than we have in the past. What role does the Supreme Court or even Congress play in? I mean, is our current polarization the cause of that malaise where we're so ideological that we can't see beyond our own worldview to establish facts and material reality? Or is it the inverse? Are we so polarized because we refuse to see, or consider facts?
If you go back into history, it's our human nature. If you go back, we're tribal, right? We come out of small tribes of people, and we had to deal with a small group of people that you're wandering the forest or the plains or the deserts or whatever. You got to believe in your leader, and you have to stay because otherwise you're not going to make it. So it's ingrained in us. The fact is that our beliefs trump facts. That's historically where we started. What has happened is our minds have pushed the world to the point where that belief is no longer a viably sound, safe belief system. We've pushed the facts ahead. We've gone into the virtual world. We've gone into the web. We no longer get our information by the dirty hands, wet feet learning of coming down out of the trees, running on the plains. And so that's what's ingrained in us, what's probably evolutionarily ingrained in us and very fundamental to us, no longer works. So that puts evolution in our own hands, and we have to change how we do things. We just don't have a choice. So I think a quick movement from the trees to the web, has made us more polarized, no question about it. But it has a source in tribalism. What did Trump talk about? Make America great. Wasn't that a tribalism? He was talking totally about tribalism. When when the Depression was on and World War II was on, Wendell Willkie ran, a Republican lawyer, ran against Franklin Roosevelt, I think it was the 1940 election, and he lost. So what did Roosevelt do? He brought Willkie into his fold to serve a major role in helping us achieve the peace, the prosperity we did through World War II. And Willkie ended up writing a book called One World. Our tribe has now become one world, and we're not quite psychologically ready to accept that message from Willkie, which was written before he died in about 1940. But we've got to get to that point.
Yeah, I agree, and I mean, I don't know how we get to that point right now. It seems as though our system is set up to really fragment us, either by parties or by states, or certainly it has evolved. We are fragmented along ideological lines, along racial lines, along class lines. How should the American people, I come from the left, so I'm going to ask on the left, but you could probably give advice for the right too. How should we use the tools of our constitutional democracy that we have left to us to to really find a consensus and to bring this country together and to start affecting the kind of change that I think the people really want. And I think regardless of where you are on the political spectrum, part of the current malaise is that everyone is dissatisfied with the current system. We might have different ideas about how to fix it or what a better system would look like, but nobody seems happy right now. What do we do? I mean, liberals have lost, I think, their recourse in the courts, which is where we've been for the last 50 years. Congress is gerrymandered beyond belief. You know, states are passing voter suppression laws left, right, and center, and that seems to be okay with the courts. What do we do? How do we make our voices heard? How do we affect change?
Well, the first thing you have to do is decide that you're going to be active. You're going to have to be active. Active means active. It means voting, but it means more than just voting. It means making political contributions to that support the issues that you think are significant. To make it, you know, we are educated today not to be citizens. We're educated today to be consumers. And so, you know, instead of credit cards for the you know, I happen to be a Mac user, so I have the iPhone, the iWatch, and all that kind of stuff. But I also make a lot of political contributions. You got to make political contributions to support what's going on. You have to get involved with programs and that makes sense to you. Now, I don't know if this will answer your question or not, but let me just tell you how I've kind of approached it. Maybe that will help. Many years ago, when I was practicing law, I did something really stupid. I was on the board of a bank along with a lot of other people, and it happened to be during Clinton's deregulation, which didn't work so well when it first started. The bank got in deep trouble. So I said to my law partners, we had the largest law firm on the west coast of Florida. I said to my law partners, I said, I'm going to take a 6 months leave of absence and get this bank straightened out. Very dumb. I was down there for 3 years. The bank failed. There was 9 years of litigation, and I lost a lot, okay, and had to start over again when I was in my 60s. But one thing I learned within that experience was that what we can do and the problems that you and I can solve are only those within the reach of our arms. In other words, how far can we stretch out our arms? And what can we do within that reach? Okay. So when I got my life back straightened out again and got things back normalized and worked, and I then ultimately decided to retire, I started to look around it. And like many people, I would give a nickel here and a dime there and do this and that and the other thing. And finally, I realized in order to do something within the reach of my arms, I had to figure out what I knew and what I could do best. And I'm an attorney. And then I looked at where do attorneys' roles in all of this that goes on. Well, law schools educate attorneys. Attorneys are the predominant legislators. They're the predominant lobbyists. They're the predominant advisors to Trump. They're the predominant advisors to everybody. So I figured out if I could, within the reach of my arms, help influence the education of young attorneys, I might be making a contribution to solving the problem we're talking about. So I talked to my wife about it, Joni. I said we've married 69 years, which means she's very tolerant. And we set up the Dick and Joan Jacobs Public Interest Law Clinic for Democracy and the Environment. And we're concentrating on that. Our resources, I'm getting people to run it. We're going to use that as an education block. We're going to use that as what you use your blog for. I use my blog for. We're going to use it for education. That is within the reach of my arms. So if I can do that, I can maybe make a contribution. All right, so you have your own talents. You have your interests. Everybody that you're going to show this video to has talents and has interests. Let them think about what they can do, what small part they can play in straightening us out. It is going to be tough. It's going to take a long time, and not everybody is going to do it the same way. But get something within your reach of your arms to make it better, and then be a good citizen. Vote, protest, speak out, join groups that you can help.
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing to remember, is that each of us do still have power in this system. You know, it might feel that we don't, but we do. And I got a sense of that. I joined an abortion rights protest in Knoxville last week, and I got a sense that, you know, each of us still does have some agency and some ability to make our voices heard and to hopefully, you know, affect change. And the point of that protest, I mean, no legislator is going to change their mind because, you know, 200 angry people marched through the streets of downtown Knoxville, but we might have made one or two people on the streets think, and that's how change gets
Yeah.
made. It starts in your community, and it starts at a grassroots level. Legislators will respond eventually, hopefully, to what the people want, or they'll lose their jobs.
That's right. You mentioned grassroots level. If you think about it, the government that you have the most influence over, or I have the most influence over, is your local government, right?
Yep.
And if you get active in your local governments, you can get change going on the local level. Now, then you have such things that they're doing in Florida and I think Wisconsin and a few other states. The state legislators are trying to limit the authority of local government.
I've seen, yeah.
That is something that can and should be objected to, and has got to be countered. So I would say, if it can't be active nationally, if you don't have the money, the job doesn't let you travel, and all that kind of stuff, get involved in your local government and get your local government straightened out would be the first step to getting something going.
And I would say that that is how the right has had so much success over the last 50 years, is they started at a local level and they worked their way up. They slowly took over the mechanisms of government, starting with town councils and school boards all the way up to state legislatures. And the left has, and I've been talking about this for some 10 or 12 years now, the left has done a horrible job at ignoring state level races, state legislatures in particular, and it has cost us. And with the Supreme Court taking up the independent state legislature doctrine next year, it could cost us everything.
Yes, and that's the problem. See, and the left has done, the Democrats have done something else. They switched from being what I would call the party of the working person to the party of the suburban elite.
Yeah, that's very true.
And that was a serious mistake, because that has contributed to two things. First of all, much of this problem that's going on here locally in the minds of people, this dissatisfaction that you talked about, that's because they're being ignored. The Republicans have talked, and Trump in particular, he talked about how he's going to take care of the common man. Of course, he never did. But at least he gave them a message that the Democrats have lost sight of, that they should have been doing.
Yeah, I think the Democrats have gotten mired in purity politics in a lot of regards. And if you are not completely with us, you are 100% against us. And I think that voters are, one, not dumb, and they can tell when you don't, when you hold them in contempt. Um, and I think that a lot of, if not Democratic politicians, certainly Democratic surrogates in the media, I mean, not to point fingers at anyone in particular, but, you know, Bette Midler has made some really offensive tweets about Kentucky, and maybe she's learned, because now she's getting eaten alive for tweeting about pronouns or something. I don't pay attention, but I paid attention to her tweets about Kentucky and, you know, being deserving of scorn and ridicule. And it just, I don't think people understand that when they do that. And Bette Midler is associated with the Democratic Party in a lot of people's minds, whether she wants to be or whether that's fair or not, because she's a celebrity, she lives on the coast, you know, these cultural assumptions that people who live on the left coast, or live on the coast rather, New York, LA, even Chicago, despise the people who live in the sort of provincial hinterlands, and they associate that with liberalism and with progressivism, and so they assume that everyone on the left must despise them, because we do often talk about the people who live in small towns and rural areas with contempt. It goes back to Obama's guns and religion comment in 2008. There does seem to be a disconnect, and I don't know how we get Democrats to see that, or the left to see that.
Well, if you look at the EPA case,
Mm-hmm.
what was the EPA against what? West Virginia, right?
Yeah, it was West Virginia, yeah.
Okay, now think about this for a second. If you go back to the Obama rule, as it was originally proposed, would require coal plants to close and to shift clean energy.
Yes.
If you're a coal miner family who lived in West Virginia your entire life, what would you think of a liberal government that is so bent on getting us clean energy, which we need, that they're willing to close the business of the only place I know how to work to make money and take care of my family? What would you think about that?
That's absolutely right, and I think that this goes back to the '90s with Bill Clinton, and I think about, actually, of all things, the film Primary Colors, and I believe it was Alec Baldwin played the Bill Clinton character. No, it was John Travolta played the Bill Clinton character, and he gives this great speech at what looks like a union rally, and he says, the jobs of the future are going to be, you're not going to need to exercise these muscles. You're going to need to exercise this muscle, and we're going to train you up for that. And that really was the promise of the '90s, was we're going to get you all into training schemes, whether it be community colleges, trade schools, or four-year universities, so that you can train for the jobs of the future. And that was an admirable goal. But Bill Clinton in the US and Tony Blair in the United Kingdom, I think, really failed to actually translate that into policy. And so you have all of these people across the United States who have really been left behind by deindustrialization and a move to sort of a service economy. And no wonder those people are angry, because, like you said, you just took away the only economic opportunity that they had.
Yeah, Clinton was in a very tough time because he had a Republican Congress, right?
Yes, he did.
He ended up passing laws, approving laws that were Republican favored in order to get something done. For example, you had the broadcast, the first, I forgot the exact name of it, but broadcast companies like Fox News or CBS had to have a fair balance, right? A fair
Yes, the fairness doctrine.
fairness doctrine. And he got rid of that. That immediately allowed Fox News to become not a news statement, but a political statement, right?
Yes.
Okay. So he also mentioned he was involved in deregulation. Back in, do you know what banks paid on CDs back in deregulation in those days? How much interest do you think you would collect? My mother had $100,000 CD. How much interest do you think she collected?
10%?
18.
18.
Now, can you imagine paying depositors 18% and then giving people money at 24% to cover the cost and not putting the country in a mess or banks in failure? It destroyed the savings and loan industry.
Yeah.
Now, deregulation of banking industry. In those days, banks could not be owned by investment banking companies. Banks had to be pure. So banks got owned by investment banking companies, and then we had the 2008 crash. What happened? Who got the money for the bailout? Where did the money start for the bailout? Started with Obama. Okay. The focus was not on the people who were hurt by it, but on the people who hurt us by it.
Right. That's absolutely true. And both parties have failed us on that note.
So we have to get off of that. I would sure like, if I had a wish, and I take the lead up on what he said. Remember, he said we had to get rid of Roe v. Wade because it was so terribly bad. It was egregiously bad, and we had to get rid of it, right? I can think of many laws that the Supreme Court has approved that are egregiously bad that you could use the same thing for, like corporations, right?
Right.
Like money is free speech. Like you can decide people have the right to guns and ignore the first half of the Second Amendment to come to that conclusion. You know, I could go. I started a little list. I took the Declaration of Independence. With half of it is where Jefferson wrote, "This is what the king did wrong," and I started making a list. I said, "Boy, this could be a book." And if I live long enough, it may be. But the point of it is, we've got to get people so strongly involved in politics that we will, in fact, solve these problems. We have to see that it hurts you whether you're Republican or Democrat. You know, privacy hurts. Lack of privacy hurts everybody.
It does.
Lack of privacy hurts everybody, and that's just the gun amendment is currently existing. It make a lot of people mad because we've got 400 million guns and 300 million people. But the point of it is, it isn't a man with a gun that protects us. It's the man who doesn't shoot that protects us.
Amen. One last question before we end for our readers. You're 91, as you said.
Right.
You've been around for many, many years working as a lawyer and working in cases of public interest with your environmental group that you've got with your wife and others as well. Are you optimistic that we can turn this ship around, or are we all doomed?
No, out of the chaos that comes today, if we have the guts to keep at it, a solution will come. There was a book written in the late 1990s, which again, if you haven't read, I think it's really worth reading. It's called The Fourth Turning. Are you familiar with that? The Fourth Turning?
I am, only because I know Steve Bannon was interested in this book, but I have not read it myself. I've heard of it because he has referenced it.
The Fourth Turning is, again, a heavily researched book, and it goes back maybe to the 1500s, a long time ago. It goes way back. It seems that we as society, tribal as we are, go through 4 stages, and it occurs every 20, 30 years. We start off doing the right thing, and we get a little worse, we get a little worse, and we get a little worse, and then we get so bad, we got to start all over again. I think it may be a metaphor as opposed to a fact, but I think we're in the fourth turning right now. I think we're in this chaos. It's going to be very tough. It isn't going to be easy. It certainly won't be solved in the years I have left. Frankly, I don't think it's going to be solved totally in the years you have left, but it will more likely start in the years that you have left, that we will again come out of it. If you go back through the history of humankind and all the things we've been through, life is not like an arrow shot out where we keep going down the same path. It's more like a loop. We keep going through, we keep repeating ourselves from good times to bad times to good times to bad times. And I do think we will get out of this, but boy, is it going to take a lot of work. My goal, personally, in the few years I have left, is to make as big a contribution to my kids and grandkids as I can to give them a chance to solve this problem. And I think anybody who's old like me needs to do it. Anybody who's young like you and younger got to do the work.
Got to do the work. That's the best advice I think that anyone can give, is you got to do the work, and you've got to work with what you've got. And what we've got is very little right now, but what we've got might just be enough.
It is enough. We all get at it. It is enough. We all get at it. Right.
Richard Jacobs, you are the author of Democracy of Dollars, and thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate you taking the time to chat.
I've enjoyed it. I look forward to watching your video.
All right. I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.